I'm sitting there, you know, trying to figure out what the hell to do, you know? What the to do, you know? I started chopping up the body. It makes me sick just thinking about it. I dismembered the body and I you know, started burning it on the stove and in the oven and stuff, and that was when you got the big smell and all.
You're trying to destroy the evidence.
Right.
See, some people.
I consciously knew I was trying to hide the evidence.
Gary Michael Heidnik, mentally ill Army veteran, stock market shark, nurse, ordained minister, father, husband, serial kidnapper, rapist, and killer, murderer. Serial killer. He is known for kidnapping 6 black women and keeping them locked away as sex slaves in the basement of his home in Philadelphia.
I was getting dressed and he came up behind me and started choking me. And he started choking me. But all I could remember was, I don't know, I guess it happened so fast, all I could remember was like a film projector of things that were going on in my life was like, you know, just flipping back.
2 of the women never made it out. Gary was a weird guy. He once survived eating a light bulb in a failed suicide attempt and used to sign his name as GM Kill. Gary's also known for being the inspiration for the character Buffalo Bill in the novel The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris, which was published in 1988. Throughout this video, I will be referring to multiple books, legal documents, and articles, the most interesting of which I believe are the works of Dr. Jack Apsh, a psychiatrist who was hired on as a researcher by Gary's lawyer, Chuck Rudo, during his trial from 1987 to 1988. Jack would go on to receive 26 letters from Gary, totaling 151 pages of material that is rarely talked about. One letter even covers another serial killer that Gary Heidnik was in prison with, Harrison Frank Marty Graham. Dr. Jack Apsh writes, "It is a quirk of history that 2 serial killers were arrested in the same section of the same city within months of each other for very similar crimes, that both suffered from chronic mental illness, that both pled insanity unsuccessfully, and that they came to befriend each other in the same jail." That's super weird. In addition to the 2 books written by Dr. Jack Apsh, I will be referring to Cellar of Horror by Ken Inglade. It was published in 1989, and this is a first edition copy, which is kind of cool. His last meal: 2 pieces of cheese pizza and 2 cups of black coffee. I cheated a little and put half and half in mine. I heard that serial killers prefer the taste of bitter things, and so they prefer black coffee. Whew. I do not like black coffee, so we know I'm sane. Gary Michael Heidnik was executed in 1999, 8 years after the release of the Silence of the Lambs movie.
It rubs the lotion on its skin. It does this whenever it's told.
So who is this freak? Well, I'll tell you. I'll tell you right now. $5 pizza from Kroger. Pretty crappy. I don't think I like coffee and pizza together. It's very acidic. It's not normal. It's not a good combination. Gary's father was Michael Frank Heidnik, and he was born on October 12, 1912 in Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, Ohio. His mother was Ellen Isabel Ott. She was born October 21st, 1918 in Cleveland, Ohio. Here is Gary's family tree. I think this is really important because Gary seems to struggle with identity, and that'll be more apparent later on. Gary's heritage on his mother's side is German. Gary's grandfather on his dad's side was Frank Heidnik, or Heidnik. You could see here on the immigration papers that the original spelling of their family name was Hajdnik. I'm not completely sure how it's meant to be pronounced, Heidnik or Heidnik, but he would later, of course, change the spelling to the current family name, Heidnik. You can see here on Gary's father, Michael Frank Heidnik's marriage certificate to his first wife, Dorothy Bruce, that it lists officially that his father's birthplace is Austria and his mother was from Yugoslavia. It also lists Gary's father's occupation as machinist. Michael Heidnik worked for Chase Brass and Copper Company in Euclid since 1932 and went on to become an Eastlake councilman. Regarding Michael's work as a machinist, I read that he was a tool and die maker specifically. Tool and die makers are highly skilled crafters working in the manufacturing industries, and Euclid was a big industrial town, especially during World War II. Michael and Ellen got married on the 1st of June 1940 in Cuyahoga County. On the marriage certificate of Gary's parents, his father's occupation is listed as welder and Ellen's occupation is listed as beauty operator. And 3 years later, Gary Michael Heidnik was born. Gary was born on November 22nd, 1943 in Eastlake, which is a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. Then about 18 months later, Gary's brother was born, Terry Frank Heidnik, born April 21st, 1945. Gary and Terry. About 6 months after that, Michael and Ellen got divorced. His mom was an alcoholic, his dad was incredibly abusive, and it really wasn't working out between them. When Gary was 2, his mother filed for and was granted a divorce because of his father's gross neglect of duty. His father contends that Ellen Heidnik was a boozer, and we'd argued about that all the time. Gary later told a court-appointed investigator that his father beat him frequently, and that his youth was very stressful with no love or emotional support. Initially, Gary and Terry stayed with their mom and her new boyfriend, but basically throughout their childhood, they would go back and forth between the parents, and, well, their childhood was not easy. In any event, she got custody of the 2 boys. Although after about 3 years, they moved back in with their father. Ellen had serious problems. Listen to this. His parents divorced, and Gary and his brother, 3 years his junior, apparently lived with their mother, who acquaintances recalled was obsessed with cleanliness. When we walked into the house on her hardwood floors, she had a dust mop wiping up our footprints, recalled a former visitor. If we used the ashtray, she would be wiping it clean before we finished the cigarette. This is from another article. Ellen Heidnik was a mentally ill alcoholic who attempted suicide several times and drank Corby's whiskey and Thunderbird wine so insatiably she sometimes had the children steal money to provide her with it. When Gary Heidnik was arrested, his brother Terry did an interview, and this is that interview. Terry said that his brother's personality seemed to change radically after Gary fell from a tree when he was 6 or 7 years old and sustained a massive head wound that deformed him to the point where other youngsters later derided him as football head. Terry said, "We used to live on a 4-acre piece of land where animals came up to the house. Gary used to feed them before the fall, but after the fall from the tree, all he wanted to do was rope them, tie them up, and hang them from a tree." Gary went to Henry W. Longfellow Elementary School, where he apparently failed the 2nd grade, and unfortunately I could not find pictures. There were like no bloody yearbooks. After about 5 years with their mom, Gary and Terry went to live with their dad and their new stepmom. In this article, Terry says, "He beat us," adding that Gary was beaten less often. Terry said that Gary seemed more influenced by his father and was always seeking his approval. "He spent his whole childhood trying to be the light of my father's eyes." Terry said that acceptance from their father was, quote, probably is what my brother was looking for his whole life. Although Terry does believe that some of his brother's behavioral issues were caused from that fall that he took out of a tree when he was a kid, he also says that his brother's behavior is a result of their upbringing by a father he described as domineering, tyrannical, and so racist that he once beat up his sons because a black co-worker had been promoted. But of course, when Michael Heidnik was interviewed, he completely denied that he was a racist or a tyrant to his only 2 children. Michael characterized his relationship with Gary as, like any father-son relationship, it had its ups and downs. Terry also said that their father forbade them to listen to rock and roll music because a lot of the singers were black. Terry portrayed his and Gary's early years as essentially a period of constant turmoil. Terry said that he and his brother were beaten for seemingly insignificant mistakes or infractions. It got to the point where we were afraid to pick anything up because he'd beat us if we dropped something like a glass or something. I got beat more often and more severely than Gary. There were some mornings I woke up with ice packs on my head. This isn't that good, but I'm actually really hungry because I barely ate today. Here's more on Gary's childhood. Gary became a Boy Scout. He had a paper route. He played baseball, though not as much as other boys. According to Roger Lullo, superintendent of the Eastlake Wilbury School District, he was not the best student we ever had. Whatever he did to make $500,000 in the stock market, he didn't show that potential here. Damn. Michael, however, remembers Gary's scholastic performance differently. He says he was very studious. He liked to read, schoolwork mostly. He got good grades in school. This is another story that Terry tells about their childhood, and this is one of the saddest ones. Terry says that their father Michael used to paint a bullseye on the seat of their pants, so like on the butt of their jeans, so that when they would go to school, kids would kick them, and that Michael also would partake in kicking his sons in the butt. So it wasn't just their classmates picking on them, they were getting picked on at home too. Gary also struggled with chronic enuresis, which is bedwetting. I'm not completely sure if Gary mainly suffered from nocturnal enuresis, which is bedwetting at night, or diurnal enuresis, which is bedwetting during the day. Apparently, children tend to suffer from one or the other, but it can be a combination of both. Children at risk for this may not have regular bathroom habits. They might have physical development problems such as anxiety. The diagnosis has to be at or after age 5, and it has to happen at least 2 times a week for 3 or more months. So it sounds like Gary would meet the criteria for enuresis because, well, he was over the age of 5 and, Gary was described as having chronic enuresis. Michael did not like that he had a son who was struggling with bedwetting, and Gary was severely punished for it. Michael thought that humiliation was the best way to deter his young son from bedwetting, and that's how he chose to handle the situation. The reaction that Michael had to this was also, I guess, a kind of embarrassment because he thought that the best response or the best solution for this problem was to punish Gary for suffering from chronic enuresis. It's clear that Michael didn't understand that it's never the child's fault and that it's emotionally abusive to make it the child's fault. Michael would hang Gary's urine-soaked bed sheets out of the window for everybody to see. I also read that Michael would make Gary sit in his urine-soaked underwear outside as a form of punishment, and he wouldn't just make him sit outside, he would lock him outside. All of this information basically comes from Terry, and I don't have multiple sources to corroborate it, so I don't know how true it is, but this comes from Terry and stories that he would tell about his upbringing. Nowadays, bullying is taken pretty seriously, but back then it was widely tolerated. Their description of their father was that he was a stern disciplinarian, and Terry outright described the abuse that they suffered from their father. Listen to this. Terry said he actually hit Gary on the head with a board and hung him out of his 3rd floor bedroom window by his feet. Though in Gary's 4th letter to Dr. Jack Apsh, dated November 13th, 1988, he says, By the way, where did you get that information that my father hung me out of the window by my feet? That never happened. My father was a strict disciplinarian, but he was never cruel. So who knows if it happened? Terry says it did, and GM Kill over here says it didn't. And we've also got Gary admitting to not having a great memory, so these are just things to keep in mind when hearing from Gary and Terry. The early signs of Gary's psychological dysfunction became pretty apparent in school. Gary apparently wouldn't make eye contact with other students while at school. There's this one story where a young female student went up to Gary and asked him, "Did you get the homework done, Gary?" And apparently he yelled at her that she was not worthy enough to talk to him. So Gary is a socially awkward kid. He was usually a good student, smart, but awkward. During a personal interview that Dr. Jack Apsh did with Gary, Gary said, "Fantasy is better than reality. Nothing can go wrong. It's the way you want it." I think that really encapsulates Gary. And that's it for this video. I'm just kidding. We're barely getting started. On top of being made fun of for his football-shaped head, Gary apparently preferred to spend time alone rather than with others. He really liked to read, and he spent a lot of his time alone reading. Dr. Jack Apsh said that reading gave Gary an excuse to be alone in his fantasy world. Reading helped him fill a void for the life that he didn't have, basically. Gary spent a lot of time fantasizing into his adult life. Gary was weird though. He also read the financial section of the newspaper as a kid, and he used to say, "One day I'm gonna be a millionaire." Gary was described as being an outcast and a loner. You know, the stereotype for the kind of person who does the things that he did. After elementary school, Gary went to Eastlake Junior High School in 1959. In one of the letters that Gary wrote to Dr. Jack Apsh, he talks about his childhood, and he says, "As I mentioned previously, I have managed to overcome the perception of being retarded as a child. I have flunked the second grade once, and was about to flunk again when Dad worked with me and made me learn. Even better, he started a fire in me whereby I liked to read books. That reading became a problem since it warped my sense of reality. I couldn't see things as they really were. I saw them vicariously through the eyes of people like Edgar Rice Burroughs." In one of his letters, Gary wrote, "I've always had problems with my memory, but it's important to remember I'm really not very bright. It takes a lot of effort on my part to achieve the educational levels I have made, but I do it with a little extra effort and an analytical mind. When something puzzles me, or if I have a problem, I will spend hours on it trying to solve it in an analytical fashion. Like, I can play a tremendous game of chess, but it takes me so long it drives the other players crazy. I'll study each and every move until I've analyzed the most possibilities and then make my move. I'm good in vocabulary though, which boosts my IQ score, but vocabulary is largely memorizing. With my love of reading, they reinforce each other. But I'm slow." He wrote slow in all caps, by the way. "Since I am so slow mentally, I can only devote so much time to the most important matters. In school, for instance, I had no social life, no parties, friends, girls, zip. I'd use that time to study and get good grades and please my father. I used to think when I was 14 or 15 that I could live in the woods, hunt with a knife and an air rifle, and swing through the trees. Really, I actually thought I could swing through the trees like Tarzan and run away from home to do so. The biggest way the books and lack of social life warped my thinking is in regards to interpersonal relationships. I couldn't see or relate with people as they really are. I always perceived them vicariously through the eyes of fiction writers. People aren't like the ones in fiction stories, especially in the books available in the 50s. Gary and Terry eventually moved back in with their mom, who had a new boyfriend. Actually, she had a succession of different boyfriends, and she was also dating a number of black men, which Michael did not like. He was not happy about his wife dating black guys. She even eventually married a black man. So you could tell that Michael Frank Heidnik, the uber racist, was likely not reacting very well to this in the least. So it definitely puts the kids in the middle of the situation because their mom also has serious issues. Like Ellen Isabel Ott was an alcoholic. Seriously, serious drinking problems. Anyways, despite Michael claiming to newspapers that he was not prejudiced at all, he wasn't cool with it. This article is from 1987 and it talks more about Gary's upbringing. Investigator Joseph A. Tobin, who was compiling a pre-sentencing report for the Philadelphia Common Police Court, wrote that he asked the father, Michael Heidnik, about his son's statements concerning their family. About Gary's remarks, Tobin wrote, he noted that his father hated his natural mother because her fourth and fifth husbands were black. According to Heidnik, his father was prejudiced and was particularly disturbed by his former wife's affairs with black men. According to the records, Heidnik said that his father, who denied all accusations of racism, was a real Archie Bunker type. He said that his father was prejudiced towards black people and that he hated his wife because she had affairs with black men after the couple divorced in 1946. Heidnik said that his mother was married 5 times, twice to black men. When asked about beating his children, he said, "Hell no, why would I do that?" And he also said he had nothing against blacks. He said, "Christ, I worked with them for years. At Chase for years and years, all of them were coloreds, or a good percentage of them anyway." Even just the way that he talks about it, to me, has a very, othering thing, a very distinction, them. In my opinion, when you have multiple different people being like, that guy's racist, I would tend to believe them. I think that if you grow up with such hatefulness being spewed, that it's going to have an impact on you. Michael coming back and saying he's not racist is like, come on, dude. Can't believe anything that comes out of that guy's mouth at this point. Gary also said that Gary was really just trying to please his old man, but that nothing he did ever seemed good enough. And eventually, Terry and Gary moved back in with their mother. His dad's a racist and his mom's dating black men. You can see the conflict there. Gary and Terry are gonna get caught in the crossfire. Anyways, by the time Gary reached the 8th grade, he had 2 main obsessions: making money and joining the military. He apparently dated girls as he got older, but there was no one special. Other people familiar with the Heidnik family said that Gary was so quiet that he shunned most of the social activities of junior high and high school. Gary's dad later became a councilman, and this guy, Robert Brown, who later served on the city council with Michael Heidnik, said that other kids would say he was a wet blanket. He wouldn't go in for sports very heavily, and he wouldn't go to the dances, things like that. The only time Robert Brown would ever see him during the summer was when Gary would get a city job through his father, painting fire hydrants and trimming grass. Robert Brown said most of the kids thought he was square. I guess that is the word. One odd thing about Gary being at such a young age is that he would read the stock market tables in the newspaper and talk about becoming rich. Michael said that he was always telling me he was going to be a millionaire, that he was going to get a lot of money, but he never said exactly how he was going to get it. Gary really wanted to become an army officer, and in the 8th grade, he was constantly wearing oversized military fatigues and talking about how much he wanted to go to West Point. Michael said that Gary talked a lot about the military. So it was no surprise in 1959 when Gary left East Lake High to go to Staunton, a prestigious military academy in Virginia. Michael Heidnik said that he scraped up the $1,500 or so that it cost to send Gary there. So here he is in his 1960 yearbook at Staunton Military Academy. And Gary was a sophomore in 1960, and his picture's right here. Gary was part of C Company, and his name is listed right here. And there is literally no way I'm going to figure out where he is in this picture. This is his yearbook in 1961, and here is Gary's junior yearbook photo. This photo best shows his football-shaped head. Here's Gary's name again, C Company, his junior year. Here is his company photo. Yeah, that's him. No, obviously I have no idea which one is him, but this should give you kind of an idea of his experience there. Also, at the end of both of the yearbooks, there is a cadet roster, and here it shows Gary's address at the time. 320 Quinton Road, East Lake, Ohio. Gary was at Staunton for 2 years before he dropped out and went to North High School in Eastlake for his senior year. Gary was a pretty good student, said Doris Thompson, manager of the alumni office. It looks good to me, she said of his record. There's nothing detrimental in there. He certainly didn't get into any trouble. His Staunton experience seemed to make Gary even more reserved. H. William Spengenberg, another city councilman who knew the Heidnik family, said, "I remember him because in our short conversations, everything was Sir and Mr. That struck me for a young gentleman of that age. In all ways, he was polite, courteous, and neat." Now, Terry has a different story. Terry said that their father pushed Gary into attending military school with the idea that Gary would eventually become a general and then president. Though Michael Heidnik said that Gary always wanted to be a soldier and had asked to be transferred from regular high school when he was in the 9th grade so that he could attend Staunton Military Academy in Virginia. He always had a thing about the military and would wear soldier shirts around the house. He wanted to go to the school, and I sent him even though it was more expensive than I could afford. And then after 2 years, he told me he didn't want to go there anymore. Gary later told prison psychologist that the reason he dropped out of Staunton Military Academy was because he was seeing a psychiatrist there, but he failed to give any details as to what they talked about or if there were any issues or what happened. They're probably like, he's crazy. The last thing we need is this nutcase giving people orders. Gary was never gonna be an army officer. Let's face it. He did have excellent grades though, apparently. But he was only there for 2 years before dropping out suddenly and going back to Eastlake, where he tried 2 different high schools and dropped out of both of them. Apparently, in September of 1961, he went to Eastlake North High School, and then a month later, he transferred to Cleveland East High School, and then he dropped out in November to join the U.S. Army. Terry, oddly enough, said that Gary hated the military and that he was doing all of this just to please his father. Terry says, "The old man was always pushing education, and Gary hated school. He was smart. He would read dictionaries and encyclopedias. My father was a councilman then, and with some political pull, arranged to have Gary take an exam for West Point. But Gary deliberately flunked the exam, and when my father found out, he ordered Gary to enlist. So Gary enlisted. His attitude was, 'You don't cross the old man.' At one point, Gary and Terry actually tried to run away to California, but were caught by police and sent back home to their father. Gary's father forced him to enlist in the Army. So in November of 1961, Gary Michael Heidnik enlisted in the U.S. Army.
Hard to believe it wasn't very long ago that I was just coming into the Army. I'll never forget that day.
He was 18 and he went to Army basic training. And I keep seeing the same quotes everywhere in different YouTubers' videos about him and on different sites, Murderpedia or the Wikipedia or whatever. Gary's drill sergeant marked him as excellent. I just need more than that. So Chapter 5 of Cellar of Horror talks about Gary's time in the military. Story time, kids. January 1962. Gary Heidnik was a good soldier. He kept his nose clean. He stayed out of trouble. He saved his money. But he probably didn't make many friends. After boot camp, he asked to be sent to military police school. The Army turned him down. The minimum age for MPs was 19. Gary was barely 18, so he asked to be a stenographic clerk. The Army again said no. A parts clerk? No. A heavy equipment operator? No. An electrician? Still no. What the Army said was, "Gary, do we have a deal for you? We're going to make you a hospital corpsman, a medic."
The hospital corpsman. Because illness or injury can strike anywhere.
So Gary shipped off to Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas for training, where he graduated.
There are no special physical requirements for the rating, and women are eligible. No security clearance is required, but there cannot be any history of illicit drug usage. The rating is open to all, including foreign nationals and immigrant aliens. But all applicants must be medical dental volunteers. Everyone accepted for this rating must attend hospital corpsman school to learn basic anatomy and physiology, the structure and functions of the human body, how to perform minor surgery and give first aid, preventive medicine, the principles of nursing, and the techniques of patient care. They become familiar with the therapeutic uses, doses, and properties of drugs, as well as their potential dangers and necessary safeguards. Students selected for advanced training may qualify as medical technologists, X-ray technicians, clinical laboratory technicians, or one of the other types of medical specialists, which are found in the civilian community. Or they may specialize in submarine medicine, aviation physiology, or medical photography. Nothing is more basic to the good life than good health. Much of the credit for keeping Navy and Marine personnel in peak condition goes to the dedicated and unselfish work of the hospital corpsmen.
His ticket was stamped excellent in both conduct and efficiency. From what he said later, Gary Heidnik learned more than how to change bandages during medic training. Suddenly, he had more money than ever before in his life, so he decided to put it to work. He later told a friend of his, John Francis Cassidy, that he became a loan shark. He hoarded his pay and allowances and loaned it to other soldiers, charging interest. He was making good money. Then the Army interfered. They tend to do that. In May 1962, he was posted to the 46th Army Surgical Hospital in Landstuhl, West Germany. His job title was orderly. Cassidy said Heidnik got to Germany, realized what had happened, and almost had a heart attack. He had almost $5,000 out in loans, and he had left in such a hurry he didn't have time to collect. Fat chance he had in Germany, he had to kiss that money goodbye. Within a few weeks, Heidnik took the test for his high school equivalency diploma. He did very well, scoring 96%. That was 28 points above the standard. Then something really strange happened. 3 months after Landstuhl, he went on sick call. On August 25, 1962, he asked to see a doctor, saying he had dizzy spells, headaches, and blurred vision in his right eye. He was nauseated much of the time and was vomiting, he added. The doctor noted Heidnik also had a visible tic. At irregular intervals, he would jerk his head horizontally. Like that? I actually once talked to somebody, a total stranger, but I had a conversation with them and they started doing that just as we were talking. And it made me think of Gary Heidnik. And I'd never seen anybody do anything like that before. So I feel like it's probably like that. Anyways, a hospital neurologist examined him and decided he was suffering from gastroenteritis. He also noted that Heidnik seemed to exhibit symptoms of a mental illness. He was either schizoid or schizophrenic. Dr. Jack Apsh, a Philadelphia psychologist, who spent months piecing together Heidnik's complicated medical records, said those initial symptoms the soldier Heidnik suffered pointed not so much towards psychosis as to the after effects of hallucinogens. While schizophrenics are noted for emotional frigidity, aloofness, and an inability to develop close relationships, Heidnik's complaints were subtly different. He admitted he did not respond well to authority, and he also griped that others did not like him because he performed his jobs better than they did. "I was by far the best," he told one doctor, and others pulled rank out of jealousy. Also, when Apsh saw the drugs that were prescribed for Heidnik, an alarm went off. His medications included stelazine, which particularly attracted Apsh's attention. It is a major tranquilizer, not a Valium. Stelazine has kick. If anyone examines the adverse reaction of these drugs as listed in physician's desk reference, it would be questionable why someone would be placed on these without a diagnosis of severe psychosis or some other psychiatric definition, said Apsh. It is obvious that they are drugs of choice for someone who is hallucinating. Apsh believed the Army must have understood Heidnik's condition was serious. On October 25th, 2 months to the day after he reported sick, Heidnik was transferred back to the United States, to the military hospital in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. There, in addition to his other symptoms, and attending physician said Heidnik also complained of seeing things moving. The doctor noted this suggested an hallucinatory experience. This had not been recorded in his Landstuhl file, although Heidnik later told Apsch he had listed it among his symptoms when he was first examined. Its absence in the initial file suggested to Apsch that it may have thrown the entire diagnosis out of kilter. Either Heidnik was having a psychotic reaction vis-a-vis the hallucination, or was responding to an hallucinatory agent, since he was not a schizoid personality type, said Apsch. It is understandable that this diagnosis of schizophrenia was totally erroneous and that Heidnik was having an hallucinatory experience. 3 months later, on January 23, 1963, an Army board reviewed the diagnosis of Heidnik as someone suffering from a schizoid personality disorder and recommended he be given an honorable discharge. Heidnik protested, but it did no good. A week later, he was dismissed from the service. Ultimately, he would be judged 100% mentally disabled. On January 30th, 1963, without being released from the hospital, Heidnik was given an honorable discharge. He served only 14 months of a 36-month enlistment. He also received a pension for a service-connected mental disability. The pension was originally 10%, but once his papers worked their way through all the channels, it was raised to 100% and made retroactive to his discharge date. Though Gary wasn't from Pennsylvania, he ended up just staying there. His brother Terry, who also eventually went to the military, ended up in Pennsylvania too. So Gary gets 100% disability from the military. He is getting $1,355 a month in 1962. Apparently, though, he was actually diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, which is not the same thing as schizophrenia. So there are multiple different iterations of what actually happened to him while he was in the military and what he was actually experiencing. The diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder versus schizophrenia would become a huge debate later in Gary's life when he started going to court. The prosecution essentially claimed that Gary started intentionally trying to have these symptoms before he even joined the military. They said that the behavior that he was exhibiting was completely planned and that the military was a way to get that documented and then get military pay. I honestly wouldn't put it past Gary Heidnik. Gary's friend John Cassidy came forward after Gary was arrested, and he said that I met Gary in 74 or 75 in Philly. He claimed the Army gave him LSD while he was in Germany. Sometime over there, he had a nervous breakdown, a legitimate, real nervous breakdown. And he said he got this brilliant idea. He said, when he came out of it, why the hell should I come out of it if I can get disability? Now, the prosecutor from the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, Charlie Gallagher, said, in the 60s, he went in the Army and he wanted to get a certain kind of training, but they ended up training him as a medic. Then they sent him to Germany, and I think he didn't like this assignment, didn't like being in Germany. So he started thinking, how can I beat this? He just stopped obeying orders. He finally got them to give him a medical discharge. Eventually, he wound up with 100% disability because he was able to convince the doctors that he was crazy. He's been faking all his life. So Gary's clearly sick. Whether or not he's truly really schizophrenic or he's just completely faking it. You know, he reads textbooks, he's smart, he knows what the symptoms are and what he has to present. So we have this prosecutor literally claiming that he just didn't want to be in the military and used this to his advantage. Some even claimed that he planned this before he went into the military. I personally think if he did, he likely came up with it while he was in the military. And his friend talking about how the military was giving them LSD, who knows? Whatever the truth is, Gary Michael Heidnik got 100% disability from the military. I personally think he was faking it. But I think in order to fake something like that, you have to be crazy. You know what I mean? I think that he is a mixed bag. I think Gary Heidnik is a super strange character. So it's 1962. Gary has an honorable discharge on his record and a history of being a medic in the military. He gets his license to be a practical nurse and begins working at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Codesville, Pennsylvania. This was a bad position for a man who thought himself superior to others. He was working as a psychiatric nurse and was not good at it. Mainly, it seemed that he didn't know how to deal with mentally ill patients. According to his peers, Heidnik was often enraged when he was treating patients. While nurses are trained to be very careful when dealing with mentally ill patients, particularly, Gary didn't care at all. He was often seen scolding patients in private and was even seen manhandling certain patients. It was not long until the hospital decided to let Gary go. The official report stated that Gary Heidnik was fired because of his poor attendance and because he was often quite rude to patients. Gary moved from Codesville to Philadelphia because he wanted to try to go back to school to get a medical degree, and he enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, but he dropped out after one semester. He could not cut it. Basically, Gary was surviving on full medical disability from the military. He bought a 3-story house on 4705 Cedar Avenue in West Philadelphia. This was in the Garden Court neighborhood, and he rented out 2 of the floors. This is where it starts getting weird. Gary had a neighbor named Alice. Alice said that there were a number of women who would go in and out of Gary's house, and that there was one particular woman, though, whose name was Dorothy. She said that most of the women were childlike. I think this is because Gary was picking up mentally disabled women, but she specifically describes Dorothy. She said Dorothy didn't talk much. She was very quiet and meek. Apparently, other residents at Garden Court were also concerned for Dorothy, and they would bring her like food and clothes and stuff. They basically brought her stuff as donations because they thought that she was being abused. Alice told this story. Gary owned this boat that had an open top, and sometimes Gary would punish Dorothy by making her sit out in the boat for hours at a time. Apparently, Alice and other neighbors reported this to the police, but nothing happened. The cops would basically come out and look around and then leave. Gary started working with the intellectually disabled around 1967, and shortly after that, he met Dorothy. Gary started hanging out at the Elwyn Institute, which is a school for the mentally disabled. Gary talks about Dorothy being a very special woman because their relationship ended up lasting for almost a decade. But Dorothy was not the first relationship that Gary had with a black woman. He had dated at least 3 different black women before her. And I feel like before talking and getting into the story of Dorothy and his time at Cedar Avenue, we really need to talk about Gary's love life. This is what Terry had to say about his brother. He said that while in Philadelphia, Gary had many female acquaintances, all but one of them black, and most of them apparently mentally retarded. Gary Heidnik never spoke about race and never spoke disparagingly about blacks, his brother said. But he believed his brother felt a need to dominate blacks and chose mentally retarded women because they were easier to control. It was how he acted, but not what he said, Terry said, adding that in light of the charges against his brother, it's so obvious now. When I was in the middle of it, I didn't see it. Terry actually came to live with Gary at one point while at the Cedar house, and they fought constantly. In one incident, Terry said his brother changed the locks on the Cedar Avenue house while he was in the hospital recuperating from a motorcycle accident. He said that when he returned home, an argument began in which Gary struck him in the head so hard with a carpenter's plank that he had to immediately return to the hospital for stitches. In time, Terry said he drifted apart from his brother, married and moved to New Jersey. One of Gary's girlfriends, when he lived on Cedar Avenue, said, "He was gentle and sweet and treated me well. Everything went normal." But then one former neighbor of Gary's said that he once escorted the neighbor's wife through his house, saying, "Here's the place where I punched my fist through the wall, and here's where I pushed my brother through when I got angry at him." This is also apparently around the time when Gary's father completely disowned his son. Apparently, Michael did a little drop by the house to see his son and found Gary living with a black woman and walked in and then immediately turned around and walked out. Just refused to speak to his son. While at Cedar Avenue, there's one specific woman that was mentioned a lot, both by Gary's neighbor Alice and others. Her name is Dorothy Knox. She is a black mentally disabled woman, and she is the woman who Gary had the longest relationship with, almost a decade actually. Gary has a type. His friend John Cassidy said that the entire time that he knew Gary, he only dated mentally ill women who were black. I can't speak for how Gary felt about this, but I believe that that is called racial fetishization. Racial fetishization. Fetishization. Racial fetishization. Which is interesting because that begs the question, if you really like black women and you're attracted to them, is that racist? Some people say no, other people say yes. I found a quote by a writer named Jaden Maurice Forbes, who in 2020 wrote an article called "The Fear of a Black Fetish." This is what he says. Racial fetishization, it's a really hard word to say. Racial fetishization is often held to a different standard than other forms of racism because the argument goes, it's just a form of preference and attraction. In reality, it's nothing more than dehumanization. He's basically arguing that, well, you only like her because she's black and not for who she actually is. Personally, and I know I'm a white person saying this, but I think that it's on an individual basis. I think that it can be a mix of both things. I think you also can't help who you're attracted to, or like Gary, a white guy who really loves black women, like that is what he wants. He just has literally pretty much no interest in white women. My thing is this, if a person is dehumanizing you because they're attracted to you because of your skin color, aren't you dehumanizing them by thinking that they're only attracted to you for sex based on how you look? Why can't they want both? I always think relationships are complicated. There's always going to be a physical attraction, always. And then comes everything else. Like, we're all visual people. It's the first thing we freaking see is how a person looks. So we know off the bat, immediately, innately, deep down, if we are attracted to them or not. And pretty much everyone has some kind of preference, you know, whether it's narrowly defined or more broad. Some people are specifically interested in people's personalities and they don't even necessarily care what a person looks like. I think that in Gary's case, it was probably both. I think he's complicated because I do think he was attracted to black women, but I also think that he knew that law enforcement and such would care less about black women who were being kidnapped or going missing, and especially black women with mental disabilities. Like, he himself told his brother and friends that he chose mentally disabled people because they were easier to control. So I think that it's a weird mix of both. What do you think? Anyways, regardless of it, that is the fact that Gary Heidnik loved black women and he really liked women with mental disabilities. This sent me off on another search about some fetish for mental disabilities, which I found. This is called devoteeism. A devotee is somebody who is sexually attracted to a person with a disability. But from what I gather, this tends to be a fetish towards a physical disability, like someone who is attracted to amputees or blind girls. Gary liked women with mental disabilities. One such woman was named Gail Linco. He and her actually had a son together, Gary's first child. He named him Gary Jr., but his son was put in foster care shortly after he was born. This made Gary angry. He felt bitter about it. It is 1968 now, the year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th in Memphis, just to put all of this on the timeline for you. In 1968, Gary had relationships with several women, one being Sonia Garrett. Sonia was 7 years younger than Gary, but the weirdest part about this is that Gary actually dated her mother. Evelyn Lynn Wilson. Evelyn Lynn, yeah. Gary dated Sonya's mother, Evelyn, and then dated her young daughter. That is so freaking strange. But it gets weirder. Evelyn was 20 years older than Gary, and she had severe mental illness and intellectual disabilities. Gary dated her for 2 years, in 1967 and 1968. And they actually had a daughter together named Angelique. So now Gary has had a second child. All the kids stuff, by the way, is very important. So pay attention. Pay attention. So anyway, Evelyn has a daughter named Sonya who's 7 years younger than Gary, and Gary seduces her. The weirdest part about this is that before Sonya was with Gary, she was with Terry. From 1967 to 1968, while Gary was with his brother's girlfriend's mom and had a kid with her, his girlfriend's daughter was with his brother, and then she started sleeping with Gary. It's weird. And Sonya got pregnant. In the words of Dr. Jack Apsh, given the timing of her pregnancy and light complexion of her mixed-race child, Gary is convinced that the boy was fathered by Terry or possibly himself, rather than his father, who was African American. Basically, Gary was just straight up taking advantage of people. No boundaries, no respect. Also, in 1968, Gary dated another woman named Maxine Roberts before she fell in love with Terry. So there is some competition going on between Gary and Terry. I don't know if any jealousy or anything was involved, but the brothers definitely had issues. They were way too involved in each other's love lives, literally. Though actually, Maxine and Terry were together for 6 years after Maxine dated Gary, and the two of them had a child together before Terry abandoned her. Also, in 1968, Gary started to date a woman named Dorothy Knox. As mentioned previously, this was the longest relationship that Gary ever had with a woman, though the two of them never had children. They lived together, but I don't know how romantic their relationship really was, because it seemed that Gary had girlfriends this entire time and had women coming in and out of his house on Cedar Avenue, and it kind of seemed like Dorothy lived at the house rent-free, but she cooked and cleaned. This is how Gary describes her. This is the woman who lived with me for 10 years. She is about 10 years older than me and spent a lot of years at Byberry before I knew her. Her mind had continued to deteriorate so badly that she had trouble going around the corner without getting lost, and she'd sign any document you wanted for a pack of cigarettes. He also said, the only person Dorothy would listen to was me, because quite simply she loved me. Boy, did she love me. If I just touched her or kissed her, she'd melt and get all goo-goo. She'd help me cook and clean the house and wash all my clothes and iron my uniform because she wanted to. Yes, this woman loved me. By the way, the emphasis I'm not just creating there, he writes in all caps. This woman loved me, and even if she did have problems, that meant a lot to me. Other people get loved very easily. They're popular and get along with others. I do not. So when somebody loves me, it means a hell of a lot more to me since it happens so seldom. I wonder why Gary. About Gary's sexual and emotional needs, Dr. Jack Apsh wrote this. He found a social group, both at work and outside of work, that he could dominate, and over whom he could feel supremely powerful. His friends were mentally challenged men, his sex partners were mentally challenged women, and nearly all were African American. His longest relationship lasted 10 years when he cohabitated with Dorothy Knox, who suffered from chronic mental illness and a severe intellectual disability. Previously, from 1967 to 1968, Heidnik dated and fathered a child by Lynn Wilson, another African American woman with an intellectual disability. Notably, he gave first expression to his deviant fantasies of multiple partners by seducing her adult daughter as well. Heidnik was king over his intellectually weak subjects. He could act out his narcissistic fantasies of supremacy and sexual dominance, but it was not enough to sate his hunger for power. Deviant sexual fantasies lose their arousing appeal for the serial abuser, who is driven to more extreme fantasies and behavior to gain arousal. Basically, Gary felt like he could manipulate them. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room. I guess he thought it was funny, he claims he has an IQ of 148. How hilarious it is to be that smart and then to have a baby with your slave who has an IQ of 30. It's all twisted. So now you have Gary's background and his love life. He's fathered 2 children by 2 different women, and none of the kids live with him. And he is cohabitating with Dorothy and has a number of different girlfriends coming in and out of his house. During this time, his mental state was not good. He spent a lot of time in mental hospitals. While Gary and Dorothy were together, some bizarre things happened. Gary was in and out of mental institutions, and he also tried to commit suicide multiple times. In 1970, on the 31st of May, Gary's mom killed herself. She had actually been diagnosed with bone cancer and was suffering from the effects of long-term alcohol abuse as a heavy alcoholic, and she decided to drink mercuric chloride and killed herself. This served to exacerbate Gary's issues. And not just Gary's, but his brothers as well. Both of them ended up in the same mental institution at the same time. I believe this was at Perrysville. According to Heidnik's brother Terry, on the night Ellen finally succeeded at suicide, she phoned her husband at a bar to tell him she'd overdosed on medicine. His father, Terry said, stayed at the bar to have another drink. The following year, Gary founded a church. In 1971, Gary had a severe episode of florid psychosis, or so he claims. One morning, he got in his 1964 Plymouth to go get coffee and donuts, and then he just kept driving as if he was possessed. He just kept driving all the way to the West Coast from Philly. Gary claims that he finally stopped once he got to Malibu, California, and that he had this command vision from God telling him to start a church. So he did. In October of 1971, Gary founded the United Church of the Ministers of God with 5 members, including his brother, his girlfriend, and other people with mental disabilities from the Elwyn Institute, his friends, so he claims. Dr. Jack Apsh said, by adding the authority of God's word to his dominance, Heidnik's flock would admire and worship him and be even more submissive to his will. Over the next few years, Gary was in and out of hospitals. So was his brother Terry, who was suicidal, schizophrenic, who had substance abuse problems. When Gary was out of the psych ward, he would go and visit his brother Terry, and he has some pretty amusing stories to tell. In one such incident, because Gary had previously worked as a nurse at one of these hospitals, he knew where the keys were, if I recall, and would unlock all of the doors at night. Or he would go into the hospital and prank his brother. This was a totally different time. Security is not what it is now, so you could go do things like this and get away with it. But it seemed like Gary was in the hospital when Terry wasn't, and vice versa, and sometimes they were in there together and they would just mess around with people, and yeah. Gary and Terry definitely had a strange relationship, as far as 2 schizophrenic brothers might have. Gary's time in the psych wards definitely says a lot about him, but it also is interesting because it really makes me wonder how much of it is true. With the whole prosecution's case that Gary was faking it, basically. According to Patrick Bellamy, author of Gary Heidnik to Hell and Back, he would often spend long periods refusing to communicate, which almost bordered on catatonia. In one of his more lucid moments, he was given a series of intelligence tests, which indicated that he was of superior intellect. On one occasion, he was admitted to a mental ward after he attacked his brother Terry with a wood plane. When he later visited while Terry was recuperating, he told Terry that if he had died from his wounds, he would have soaked his remains in a bathtub full of acid to dispose of his body. With each admission to hospital, his behavior became more bizarre. He spent most days completely mute, only communicating by writing notes. He constantly wore a leather jacket, which he refused to take off. His personal hygiene was almost non-existent, and he developed a series of mannerisms such as saluting and rolling up one pants leg when he didn't wish to be disturbed. Regarding Gary's church and his congregation of mentally disabled people, mostly from Elwyn, Gary talks about his relationship with his congregation in letter 5 to Dr. Apsh. Pro quo, if you will, I never took advantage of anyone or exploited anyone. If I had, they would have quickly rejected me and abandoned me. As for fiduciary relationships, the money usually went from me to them. I was always buying them food in restaurants, coffees, brunch, etc., especially to members of my church. As you know, I often took them to Roy Rogers or to McDonald's, Great Adventure, Hershey Park, etc. One of their favorite places was a smorgasbord called Duffy's. At various times, I was called upon to supply room and board, and if they had money, I charged them $200 a month. If they didn't have it, I supplied it gratis. If you think you can make a profit today on $200 a month, try it. That's why everybody always charges more for room and board. They even have their own private rooms, TVs, stereo, and the use of the house. Barbara got the use of the master bedroom or waterbed, etc. I slept in the back bedroom, the smallest of them. At one time or another, Tony Green, Gail, and Robert roomed with me. There was no financial exploitation on my part. If there was, they'd have left a long time before they did. They all showed substantial weight gains too, since the food was also adequate. My favorite time was with Sandy. He's talking about Sandra Lindsay. My financial rewards for these services were negligible. The human rewards were tremendous. Gary is really all about making himself appear like a god, some kind of savior of sorts. Now to talk about Merrill Lynch. In 1975, Gary opened a Merrill Lynch account in his church's name. Over the next 12 years, he succeeded in parlaying $1,500 of investments to over $500,000. This is very impressive considering that during this time he was in and out of mental institutions, but much of the time he was ministering to the people around him. He had to play the role as Bishop Gary to keep his investments intact. In a letter to Jack, though, Gary actually claims that his church in 1975 was worth $125,000. Charlie Gallagher, a prosecutor with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, said this about Gary's investments. There was a sign on his house, United Church of the Ministers of God. He had an ID card as Bishop Heidnik in a Roman collar. With the checks he was getting from the Army and Social Security, he started investing the money in his church's name. The first thing he invested in was Playboy, and later he lost a lot of money on Crazy Eddie. Eventually, he changed $1,500 in investment money to $750,000. So not all of the numbers add up, but it's consistent. The story is consistent enough that he had 1,500 bucks. Whatever that turned into, I personally think that it turned into about $500,000. Yeah, Gary did very, very well for himself. But his friend John Cassidy said that he was kind of strange in how he showed that he had money. He had a lot of money. He had a Rolls Royce, a Cadillac, but at one point he was driving around in a trailer and sleeping on the street in it in Southwest Philly. I don't know when exactly he's talking about, but I do think that that's super strange. It's one of those weird things that make me think, okay, Gary really is mentally ill. I mean, he's clearly strange, but is he schizophrenic? Do you know what I mean? I don't know. Maybe eating more pizza will help. Gary loved the idea of being wealthy and having prestige and being somebody in the community. being a figure, a pillar of the community, basically. He apparently loved when people called him Bishop Heidnik and would actually hold services on the first floor of the house. He had that sign out front, the United Church of the Ministers of God. But more importantly, he did all of this and made his investments in the name of the church for tax exemption status. Gary wanted all of his investments to be tax exempt, plain and simple. That's why he made the church. He didn't want to pay taxes on the money he was making in his investment accounts. Fun fact, Gary's favorite financial writer was Andrew Tobias. I'm out of coffee, guys. I need to go make some more. So I'm gonna go get one more and I will be right back. Psh. And we're back with more coffee. It's 1976 now. This is the start of Gary's arrest history. His criminal history begins this year. Gary started having some issues with his tenants. Basically, it was a nice normal day out and Gary goes upstairs to one of his tenants, knocks on the door to collect rent, and his tenants refuse. They are on rent strike. The tenant's name was Robert Rogers, or Big Robert. That's his nickname. And he actually was an ex-police officer. And he lived there with his family. And Robert did not like Gary. Gary the landlord and Robert did not get along. Remember Alice, the neighbor who had called the police multiple times on him for how he was treating Dorothy? Well, she said this. Everyone knew Gary was nuts. He had a very scary, expressionless face. Intense, but expressionless. You had the feeling that he could fly off the handle at any moment. Gary has an incredibly long explanation of what went down with all of this, which he writes to Jack in a letter. And I'm not going to read all of it because I am not exaggerating when I say that this is very long. So I will summarize for you what happened. But Jack says this: the reliability of Heidnik's narratives is always subject to skepticism, but I think there is more truth than fiction in this particular account. So I'm trying to take Jack's word and believe most of what Gary is saying here. For some reason in the letter though, he calls Robert Rogers Mr. Harper, but he is writing this about a decade after the fact, so I guess that's not a big deal. Gary and Robert have an altercation, and Gary also accuses Robert's wife of making a pass at him. Don't know how true that is. Gary was arrested for aggravated assault. He starts his letter off by saying, in '76, when I was arrested for aggravated assault, I'm going to tell you the real truth, not the garbage they're mooring their lies with. The whole thing never made it past arraignment. The judge threw it out right then. In 1967, I bought 4706 Cedar Avenue for something like $13,500. It's a nice 3-apartment building. I moved in on the 3rd floor with Dorothy and rented out the 1st and 2nd floors. On the 2nd floor in '76 lived a fellow by the name of Harper and his live-in girlfriend. Based on the records, Jack says that this is Robert Rogers and his wife and family. Gary says Harper's girlfriend made a couple passes at me, not real heavy though, and I turned her down. Not out of moral convictions or anything, but for money. If you start diddling with your tenants, you're not going to get your rent money. She had a nice face and body too, but she was the wrong color. She was white, and you may have noticed I don't much care for white women. Anyway, he says, by the way, Mr. Harper is black and his girlfriend is white. You'd think we'd have gotten along on that basis. No? Weird assumption, Gary. Anyways, Gary's side of the story is that these two decided to save some money by going on rent strike. They claimed that their apartment needed some fixing. It did. A little. Not much, but they never came to me and said something. They just plain stopped paying rent. They didn't even follow the usual course of calling in L&I and having the complaints made official. They just figured I was some turkey. I am. And they were going to live there for years, rent-free. Of course, I'm legally obligated to pay all my bills like mortgage, heat, gas, electric, water, insurance, taxes, etc. Basically, what they're doing to me is legalized theft, since in fact, or reality, tenants can do this in Philly and get away with it. He also mentions that Harper, Robert Rogers, was an ex-Philly cop, so that he had the law on his side and all that. Gary goes on to say that the tenants on the first floor got wind of this and decided to join in on the strike out of sympathy. So what Gary decided to do was shut off their gas, electric, water, and heat and locked the cellar door and told them to leave. What I was soon to find out was that Mr. Harper, an ex-policeman, is above the law. Gary claims that the tenant on the first floor and Robert Rogers broke into the cellar and turned everything back on. And then to, get back at him, they turned his electric and gas and heat off. Gary writes, "So I was pretty mad when I found my cellar broken into. In these days, I stupidly believed that the law was the law and had to be obeyed by everybody." No, the fuck you didn't, Gary. No one believes that. You believe that. So this time, when I shut everything off, I also locked the steel gate that closed off the cellar. So Gary's waiting. He says that the tenants tried to break in again, but this time he was watching and waiting, so he called the cops immediately. And when the cops showed up, he said that Robert Rogers' girlfriend or wife or whoever talked to the police and got them to leave so that nothing happened. Apparently, Robert Rogers got his and the other tenant got all of their electric, heat, and water and whatever turned back on. And so now for a third time, Gary goes down to the cellar. This time, I decided to make a citizen's arrest. So I shut off everything, locked the steel gate, and waited. In a couple hours, they showed up and broke in. I showed myself and pulled out a pistol, simple action 6-cylinder reproduction antique, and announced, "You're under arrest." An interesting thing about human nature, and I'm not a racist, he wrote that part in parentheses, is if you pull a gun on a white man, they'll cooperate, give you everything you want, or run. You pull a gun on a black man and they'll want to fight. That's exactly what happened. The white guy ran and the black Mr. Harper advanced on me wanting to fight. Gary definitely sounds freaking racist. I personally think that Mr. Harper Robert being an ex-cop, not because he's black, but because he has training, was more likely to pursue Gary. That's just my opinion. But Gary claims that he put the gun to the side and shot off a round in his cellar to prove that he was willing to shoot his gun. Gary says that in court, Robert Rogers claimed that Gary actually pointed the gun at him and tried to shoot him. And Gary gets all offended in his letter to Jack and says that he was only 3 feet away. I wouldn't miss. But anyways, an altercation ensues from that, understandably. Gary also claims that he had a loaded rifle around the corner that he also could have used if he really wanted to shoot him. He claims that the police confiscated the rifle. He claims that him and Robert ended up going upstairs, like the police got called because of the gunshot, and that they went up onto the lawn, basically, and that I keep saying Mr. Harper, that Robert Rogers actually sucker punched Gary in the face and that he fell backwards. Apparently police were already there, so they witnessed to this, and so they grabbed Robert Rogers and held him back to subdue him, and then they took both of them to the police station. Apparently, Alice, the neighbor, had been yelling out to the police, no, it's not Robert, it's Gary. And then they realized that Gary was actually the aggressor. Gary writes, "When we got to the station, I got put in a cell, and for him, it was, 'Hey, old buddy, haven't seen you in a while,' and they had a big friendly get-together, and of course, I'm the only one who got arrested, not him." Gary goes on to say, "That's how the blue code really works." I mean, he's not wrong about that. Gary was taken in and charged with aggravated assault and carrying an unlicensed pistol. Gary claims that the judge completely threw out the aggravated assault charge because they proved that the tenants had been breaking in to his cellar. And I don't have the documentation on this, but basically that is the first charge that he got, whether or not it was completely dropped. Gary clearly has a temper. Multiple people have said so. And yeah, that's a really weird game to play with tenants. There's a whole legal process for that kind of thing. And Gary, you know, himself believes that he's above the law. The reasonings that this was thrown out were different from what Gary gave in his letter. The first was because the ex-cop tenant failed to appear and testify. The second was because the other tenant admitted to breaking into Gary's private property. So the court ended up siding with Gary as the landlord in this case. He was also successful in getting the police to return his rifle and his antique pistol. Gary started to date a black woman with intellectual disabilities named Anjanette Davison. She was also illiterate, and Gary claims that he taught her how to write her own name. At this point, Gary had been, in the words of Dr. Absh, exploiting persons with intellectual disabilities for 11 years and operating his church for the disabled for 6 years, long before finding Anjanette. In this letter, Gary talks about the introduction of Anjanette into his life and how it was somewhat of a transition from Dorothy to Anjanette, but that they somewhat all lived together. The problem with Dorothy was she couldn't have kids. And as you know, I wanted kids, lots of them. Anjanette could give me kids. Dorothy wanted to more than anything, but she couldn't. After 10 years with Dorothy, I realized I'd never have kids by her, and so started looking elsewhere. But I couldn't give up on Dorothy either. This woman loved me. Not I loved her, but she loved me. This woman loved me. And even if she did have problems, that meant a lot to me. So Dorothy meant a lot to me. And I couldn't just cast her aside and abandon her because I wanted kids so bad. But with Anjanette, that wasn't necessary, since Anjanette did not protest against Dorothy's presence, and the two of them got along. In June of 1977, she gets pregnant from Gary. On March 16th, 1978, Anjanette gave birth to a daughter, so Gary's third child. They named her Anne Maxine Norton. She was born and immediately taken away by Child Protective Services. This is the third child of Gary's who has been taken away into foster care. Gary essentially loses it. He's obsessed with having a lineage, he's obsessed with having babies and lots of kids, and he frickin' loses it. Gary wrote about this whole thing in letters to Jack. He said, "I had of course desired children desperately, and since I couldn't have any with Dorothy, I began looking elsewhere. That was when I chanced upon lower society's fellow rejects, Anjanette Norton. She had been rejected and unloved by her own social group as well as her family, as I had been. We both experienced this ostracism, this vacuum of belonging. Two ships cast adrift in the night, searching, and by luck we found each other." Yeah, Anjanette sounds real lucky. Perhaps because our needs were so great, it is that our love was so strong. We also shared a common desire to have children. Unfortunately for us, though, we were of very different races. She was black and me white, whereas Dorothy and I couldn't have any children. The bigots begrudgingly left us alone. But now with Anjanette, children were not only possible, but one had arrived, and more were in the offering. This was a situation racists couldn't permit to endure, so they undertook to separate Anjanette and myself. Because of my mental illness and Anjanette's functional retardation, they resorted to the fact that I was crazy and took advantage of the helpless. They succeeded in framing me for a crime that never occurred and putting me in jail for 5 years. In another letter that Gary wrote, he said, "While Anjanette was living with me in 1978, she had been actually kidnapped by her family. While I was away, they came around to the house and invited her to the gallery to do some shopping. Instead, they took her to her mother's house and refused to let her leave. After a day or two, I finally got one of her other sisters, Bertha, who told me where Anjanette was. I immediately went over there. It was in North Philly, and demanded they release her. Anjanette also made it plain to her family that she wanted to go with me. Now allow me to retrogress a little. A couple of months previously, I had tried to get Anjanette on SSI. This move on my part, I considered one of the biggest mistakes of my life. Up until this time, Anjanette had virtually no money and no income. Thus, nobody, including her family, especially had an interest in her. Anjanette's family did not like her and had put her into the institution at about 15 just to get rid of her. They only visited her one time in 15 years, and the only reason that they visited her was to borrow money. So when Anjanette was discharged from the Elwyn Institute, she either had no money or her SSI was canceled because they said she needed a guardian. At the time, Anjanette couldn't even write her own name. Since Anjanette had no money, her family was not interested in her. And when I met Anjanette, she was living in a boarding home. These are so long, and I'm not gonna go on and continuously read the whole thing, but Gary completely makes himself the victim here. He goes on a whole spiel about how Anjanette's family is against him because he's white and they absolutely couldn't have a mixed baby in their family. Gary also said that he had been taking Anjanette to a prenatal clinic and that the nurse who worked there was racist and that there's some kind of conspiracy thing going on, and she kept tabs on Anjanette because they didn't want them to have this baby. He says that she was trying to take Anjanette away from him. Gary wrote this: "She was not only a so-called liberated feminist, she was a vocal black racist. She had black power pictures all over her office. When she discovered that Anjanette was living with the white man and was going to have a mixed child, she was incensed." The truth of the matter, I don't know anything about the nurse, but basically Anjanette's family had not seen her in a long time because she'd been with Gary. So her sister was concerned and went over to Gary's house to look for her. Bertha, Anjanette's sister, came to the house to figure out what was going on with her sister. This is the official description of what actually happened when Bertha found her sister. 8 months pregnant with sunken eyes, insufficient weight, and indications of physical abuse. Bertha immediately took Anjanette to Einstein Hospital and threatened to have Heidnik arrested if he tried to stop her. 1 month later, Anjanette delivered the baby. A large fibrous tumor prevented normal childbirth, so a cesarean section was necessary. Shortly thereafter, Heidnik was accused of starving and mistreating Anjanette, denying her prenatal care, and giving her his own prescription medications. The Department of Public Welfare promptly took custody of the baby. The next day, Anjanette returned alone to live with Heidnik, where she received no postpartum care. Gary is like using this race card thing and how he's all like peace and love and interracial babies and stuff, but the truth is Gary is a piece of garbage and he wasn't treating people well at all. I don't think he could even properly care for himself. Gary claims that he never abused Anjanette and that he was heartbroken that the baby was taken away. This is what he says: "Some people came to my apartment from Booth Maternity Center and tried to get her to leave. Anjanette was under a lot of pressure to either abort or leave me." Gary claims that he stopped paying for prenatal care at 6 months because of this. I guess because he felt he couldn't trust anyone because people kept trying to get Anjanette to leave. He actually wanted to deliver the baby at home in secret and not tell anybody, but luckily that didn't happen, and Anjanette's sister Bertha was able to get her sister to a hospital. About all of this, Dr. Apsh writes this: "For all the distortions of Heidnik's accounts, he does reveal a pitiable sadness about the loss of their baby. He invested the greatest of hopes in his fantasy of having a child of his own. He insists that he loved Anjanette and was loved by her. He was outraged to be judged as unfit parents because of their respective mental disabilities. He denounced the social worker as a rabid feminist and racist who was incensed by the idea of an interracial couple having a mixed child. He complains that the authorities not only seized custody, but filed a restraining order to stop him from visiting Anjanette and the baby in the hospital. They even conspire, in Heidnik's account, to change the baby's name. The misrepresentations of Heidnik's account notwithstanding, the psychological loss of his fantasized baby was a profound blow to Gary's fragile ego. The narcissistic injury was the key turning point in his life. Until now, Heidnik lived within the law. Kind of. Mostly, though, he did. Henceforth, he will do anything to secure his own baby, starting immediately with an attempt to steal his baby from the hospital. From this point forward, Heidnik will be totally obsessed with his baby fantasy, which will ultimately drive him to commit his worst abominations. He believes that having a baby of his own will achieve vindication for his lifelong inadequacy and will serve as a crucial bulwark against the self-loathing of his own weakness. That was a very, very powerful summary from Dr. Apsh about this entire scenario with Gary. And what happens next is quite terrifying because Gary does do something incredibly rash. Gary is definitely escalating now. In 1978, Gary experiences his first imprisonment. This is a horrifying crime. It's very scary and very serious. It is around this time that he gets rid of Dorothy. So after over a decade, Dorothy is gone. Gary claims that boarding home operators kidnapped Dorothy. Dr. Apsh says it is unknown how Heidnik got rid of Dorothy, but he may have sold her to one of the same boarding home operators that he accuses of kidnapping disabled clients. Whatever happened, whatever the truth is, Dorothy is gone. This woman was loyal and loving to Gary frickin' Heidnik for 10 years, and he just got rid of her. After this, Gary and Anjanette reunite. Dorothy's gone, they're together at the house, and Gary begins to come up with a foolproof way to secure a baby. A foolproof way that the government and nobody nowhere can interfere and take away a child from him ever again. Anjanette had a sister named Alberta who is mentally disabled, and since about 14 years old, she had been living at Selinsgrove Center in Penn Township. This is a center for the mentally disabled. So on May 7th, 1978, 2 months after CPS has taken away Gary's child, he and Anjanette make the 4-hour drive to Selinsgrove Center and sign out Alberta for family visitation weekend thingy. And I guess Gary's hoping that no one will notice that Alberta never returns. Gary had a plan to have a secret child with her that the authorities could never take away. So he imprisons Alberta in his basement, keeping her locked away in a closet, and rapes her multiple times with the plan of having a secret child with her. Of course, they signed her out, and she literally has been living there since she's 14 years old, and he clearly underestimates the authority of the Selinsgrove Center, who have been calling his residents. It's only 4 hours away. They've been calling his residents multiple times, trying to figure out where Alberta is. After getting no response, they notified the police. 10 days after Alberta left Selinsgrove with Heidnik and her sister Anjanette, on May 17th, the staff social worker, Mrs. Snaufer, and the staff psychologist, Dr. Bingham, traveled to Heidnik's house in West Philadelphia, accompanied by the Philadelphia police and armed with a search warrant. So with the search warrant, all bets are off. There's no excuses. They enter the home, and initially they can't see or hear anything, so they start calling out Alberta's name, and they can hear this sound that's like very muffled. They trace these cries that they're hearing to the basement. They find Alberta in an unlit storage closet, which was a former coal bin. In one of his letters to Jack, he actually drew a picture of the coal bin where he kept her, where authorities found her. Alberta was taken back to the hospital, the mental institution, and it was determined through an exam that she was no longer a virgin. She had been raped and sodomized. Gary Heidnik was charged with kidnapping, rape, unlawful restraint, false imprisonment, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, and interfering with the custody of a committed person or a disabled person. This story is also corroborated by Gary's friend, John Cassidy, who said, in the 1970s, he had this girlfriend. She was black and retarded. He has an IQ of 148, but all his girlfriends were black and retarded. He said that blacks treated him better than the whites ever did. He also said he sexually preferred blacks, that they expected less. His girlfriend was Anjanette, I think they eventually had a daughter, and Anjanette's sister was severely retarded, and he took her out of the institution and brought her home, and they said he kidnapped her. I want to just say one thing, don't shoot the messenger. I'm reading quotes. So, the craziest thing about this whole story was that Gary believes that he was framed. He goes on and on and on about how the state took away his baby, and it's this horrible conspiracy theory, and that Alberta, he didn't kidnap her. She wanted to live with him. But in November of that same year, November 1978, Gary's case went to trial. Gary pled not guilty. He claimed that he was innocent, and he even took the stand to defend himself. Part of the evidence presented by the prosecution was that Alberta had an STD, which proves that Gary raped her. This is what Gary wrote. First, it's important to point out this. They didn't claim gonorrhea of the vagina, but of the mouth. I'm positive she didn't have gonorrhea at all. They manufactured her sickness just as they manufactured so many other false claims and spurious evidence. They wanted to put me away for several lifetimes, not just a couple of years. By claiming gonorrhea of the mouth, this enabled them to add the additional charges of deviant sexual conduct. Paradoxically, the claim that Alberta did have gonorrhea may have been the best thing that happened to me. Yes, my new lawyer, Pressman, did know about the fact I didn't have gonorrhea, and he used it for all it was worth. That single fact alone, that I tested negative for gonorrhea, shows scientifically that I hadn't copulated with Alberta, orally or otherwise. The prosecution, not to be outdone, then tried to prove that I had access to antibiotics and had cured myself, even though I didn't copulate with Alberta, and this proves I didn't. I'd still like to show and expose the conspiracy against me, so please check the records and verify. This is like the tip of the iceberg with Gary Heidnik and conspiracies. Reading all of these letters, like I've read all of them, and going through them, he goes wild. Like the more serious his charges get, you know, with murder and all that, the wilder his conspiracies get about the state being just dead set against him. The best part about this whole thing is the psychological examination that Gary was given. This exam found that Gary was, quote, manipulative and psychosexually immature. Now to Gary's sentencing. He beat the kidnapping and rape charges. He was found guilty of false imprisonment and sentenced to 5 years at Graterford State Prison, though he spent 3 of those 5 years in state mental institutions. In and out of different psychiatric hospitals, he was transferred to different ones. 3 wards that I know of were Potisville, Graterford, and Fairview. I also read about Gary being at Norristown, but I'm not completely sure about the dates associated with that stay. And his behavior was very bizarre. Listen to this. Gary Heidnik was a paranoid schizophrenic with delusional thinking, command hallucinations, and escalating obsessive deviant sexual fantasies. While in Fairview State Hospital for the criminally insane, Heidnik remained mute for 3 years. That is 1,005 days from 1978 to 1981, because the devil put a cookie in my throat. In a series of parole board hearings which took place over several months, he communicated exclusively by passing notes. He also brought a Bible to one meeting in which he had highlighted passages about Satan removing voices and biblical characters who became mute. At the end of the meeting, Heidnik signed his name as GM Kill instead of GM Heidnik. His muteness continued until the day he entered a church and his voice magically returned during the service, restored in his mind by God. There are many examples of psychotic delusional thinking in Heidnik's psychiatric history, including religious obsessions. He said that he frequently conversed with God and that Jesus appeared to him in bright lights and made him feel warm and tingly. Heidnik's psychotic delusions and sexual deviant obsessions proved to be a deadly, egotistical mix. In the words of Dr. Jack Apsh, as we now know, this crime at 4706 Cedar Avenue would be prophetic, replayed with unimaginable horror 10 years later at 3520 Marshall Street. Gary was not a good patient. He was difficult. In 1981, Gary was at Fairview, and then he returned to Graterford in 1982, where he was put into solitary. While in solitary, Gary claims he did not speak. So multiple different sources saying that Gary did not speak. Gary, in one of his letters, Gary writes, "Also, I never talked that whole time. Anybody or any claims that I did, the person is lying or suffering auditory hallucinations." And I do believe that he remained mute for a while, but I think it was definitely to serve his own purposes, whatever those were. There's a lot of talk about Gary faking illnesses. Dr. Jack Apsh wrote, "The obvious motive for feigning mutism would have been to get himself transferred from a harsh prison to the more pleasant surroundings of an inpatient psychiatric unit. But if Heidnik was faking symptoms, he would have known that this strategy could backfire by showing the parole board that he was too deranged to be safely paroled." While I do believe that Heidnik must have been acutely psychotic during this time, it is possible that, as his symptoms lessened, he was able to recognize the secondary gains of maintaining his mutism and exercised more volitional control over his speech. These clinical questions raise the broader question of how well any psychiatric patient can remember events from a period of acute psychosis in which typically there are severe deficits in attention, concentration, and logical cognition. Heidnik himself admits to having memory issues, and I think that he is a weird mix of as Jack said, actual psychosis and of faking symptoms. He's a very complicated person. In one of his letters, Gary writes, "It seems the sicker I got, the more I forgot." So, I mean, Gary knows he has memory issues. He hasn't been shy about talking about that. I also do believe that it would be incredibly traumatic. He's now had 3 children, and just the whole experience of losing all of them and then being put in prison when he had this fantasy. He was so dead set on this fantasy of having this secretive baby, and now he's in prison for, false imprisonment. So, or not prison, but, state mental institutions as a prison sentence. But I think that it was probably a shock to him. I think that he's narcissistic and crazy and couldn't handle what happened. I am sure that it contributed to the downfall of his mental illness. We know that it did, because right as he got out, things got a lot worse. Under the supervision of a state-sanctioned mental health program, Gary was released on parole in April of 1983. He was arrested March 1978, released April 1983. It's 60 some odd months. It's almost the full 5 years of his sentence. One of the craziest things was what a court psychologist actually said about Gary. This was in connection to his 1978 case. This court psychologist reported that he presented a high probability for serious or even bizarre offenses against relatively helpless members of the community. Soon after the whole thing happened, Gary moved. He moved to the infamous 3520 North Marshall Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, zip code 19140. Get this is the creepiest part of the whole thing. Because the neighbors have found him to be such a strange person, they decided to go over to where he lived just to check out his apartment. They wanted to explore the residence. They said that the place was filled with trash and that there were stacks and stacks of porno magazines, and that in the concrete basement there was a pit. When Gary was arrested for kidnapping and murder, a pit was found at 3520 Marshall House. The fact that he had also dug out a pit in concrete at his Cedar Avenue house proves that he was already kind of delving into this kind of strange behavior. Alice, the neighbor, said, "It was very peculiar. We all joked about it at the time. It was just Gary being creepy." There is documentation from an interview that a psychiatrist conducted with him in 1984, and what they said is like so many red flags. Listen to this. Heidnik was found to have persecutory. Heidnik was found to have persecutory grandiose delusions, distorted insight, and judgment severely impaired. He was found to be incompetent, Dr. Apsh wrote, "This same psychiatrist predicted heinous crimes would be committed by Heidnik in the future, or he would hurt himself." How many red flags does one need? And then he's just released? Gary claims that when he got out, his church was worth about $350,000 and that his sentence was so long because the judge was trying to acquire it. He writes to Jack and says, "Upon being released, I sought to rejoin that social group which had given me the greatest measure of acceptance, the mentally handicapped. The mentally handicapped do indeed form their own social group, and it isn't influenced by things like race. Most handicapped are rejected by so-called normal society and seek comfort and belonging with each other. Indeed, this social group's pride even built my church. It was a territory no mainline church was interested in, since it was both poor and took a great measure of patience and time, understanding, if you will. By the handicapped, I was readily accepted. I was compatible in two ways. Since I was also mentally ill, they recognized me as one of their own. Also, since I was extremely competent and willing to assist, I was doubly acceptable. It was my symbiotic relationship. I exchanged my competence for their companionship and friendship." Wow, that's so sweet of you, Gary. Gary is looking for a bride. He gets out in 1983 and he starts going through mail order magazines. Gary goes to a matrimony service, the kind that lists ads for mail order brides. His selection criteria was simple. He wanted an Oriental virgin. A few weeks later, he was corresponding with a young Filipino woman named Betty Disto. They talk for about 2 years before he proposes to her. It's nice and cold now. This is from a newspaper article. Paroled, Heidnik resumed a relationship with Jewel Mosley Cintron, a black woman 7 years his senior who worked with him as a practical nurse. Cintron, who her daughter said had been tranquilized for 27 years because she hears voices, boasted yesterday in several interviews of being Heidnik's spiritual wife. In 1985, he bought the house on Marshall Street to keep tabs on Cintron. Heidnik had at least 5 spiritual wives and dated other women. Cintron said Heidnik dated women of all races but preferred blacks. His spiritual wives were never jealous, she said, and they frequently participated in joint sex with him, even when he decided to marry his pen pal from the Philippines in October of 1985. "We were as simple as him," said Cintron. "He told us if we liked him, we'd all put up with it. We all loved him. He demanded submission and was sexually insatiable," Cintron said. "Lovers who angered him were brutally reprimanded," she said. Heidnik tended to mistreat his white women because, Cintron explained, they talked back. Always, Cintron said, he hoped to sire new children. He boasted of having at least 6 and wanted more. In his customized van, he prowled about the Elwyn Institute once again, looking to pick up new dates among the mentally retarded women who worked there. He would take them back to the house. He would impress them with his suave demeanor, the 1971 Rolls-Royce, the new Cadillac and Lincoln in the garage, and his title of bishop. Some he would lure with generosity, buying them clothes and treating them to dinners. It was this seduction that enticed Francina Waddle, 23, to his church home 3 weeks ago to watch a video movie. But she became frightened. It wasn't the bedroom wall papered with $1 bills and $20 bills that scared her, nor was it the kitchen walls with pennies and nickels lacquered to the wall. It was the whip and chains adorning the bedroom wall and the handcuffs on the dresser that told her it was time to go home, quickly. He was kind of cool, but a little weird, she said. So Gary has lots of girlfriends, and he has this new house, and yes, as you heard, Gary's house was very strange. He covered the walls in money. The kitchen was covered in pennies, and then upstairs, and I believe along the banister, like the wall that was parallel with the stairs, he covered it in bills. It was like his wallpaper. At the North Marshall house, Gary is also boarding, as he did at the Cedar Avenue house. He had a friend named Tony Green. Tony lived with him, and Tony had a girlfriend named Sandra Lindsay. Sandra actually went on to board at Gary's house for a while, so they knew each other. Gary told Dr. Apsh that living with Tony and Sandra was his favorite time of his life. Gary said, Tony dated her for a couple of months in 85 and 86 in an on and off again love affair. I also dated Sandy at times. Gary's relationships weren't really fulfilling to him though. Gary and Betty correspond by mail and the occasional phone call. He promises her a lavish life and she honestly seems kind of excited. He told her that he was a minister of a religion and a man of God, and Betty accepted his proposal. Betty arrived from the Philippines in September of 1985. Heidnik met her at the airport, and after they greeted each other, he took her home to North Marshall Street. He took her home. They went upstairs to their bedroom, and in her wedding bed, she was shocked to find a naked woman asleep. Heidnik explained to her that this woman was a paying tenant. Despite all of the red flags, Betty and Gary married on October 3rd, 1985 in Maryland. For the first week or so, Heidnik seemed to treat her very, very well. They talked about starting a family, but their marriage rapidly deteriorated. And I mean that literally. Just a week after they got married, Betty got home from a shopping trip and found her husband in bed having sex with 3 women. She was horrified and she demanded that he pay to send her back to the Philippines, but he refused. He told her that he was the boss and that having multiple sex partners was completely normal for him, so she better get used to it. From that time onward, Heidnik pretty much always had other women around, and often Betty would have to watch him have sex with other women. On the occasions that she would complain about this, he would beat her. He ordered her to cook for him and for the partner that he was with at the time, whoever that might be. As the days progressed, he became more and more volatile. He threatened Betty. He told her that if she tried to leave him, he would find her and kill her. Hi, guys. What's up? I don't know what happened to this next section, but not only is the video file missing, so is the audio file. So I don't know, but they're gone. So bear with me and I will be recording this next section just really quickly. I'm using the same microphone and I'm not using all of my lights, it's just a ring light. And I'm in a completely different room. Not even that, I'm not even in the same state as when I recorded the original stuff, so this is going to be a bit different. There is serious trouble in paradise between Gary and Betty quickly realizes this. She doesn't really know anyone in Philadelphia except for Gary and his friends, so what she does is she turns to the Filipino community. She was done with him bringing other women home. She was done with him raping her and abusing her and beating her, and she was ready to leave, and she was going to do whatever she needed to do to get away from Gary freaking Heidnik. So in January of 1986, very shortly after she arrived to the United States and married Gary and everything like that, she decided to leave. She was done. And she talked to somebody, and I wish I knew who she talked to, but sadly I don't. But she talked to somebody who basically convinced her to get out. I don't actually think it took that much convincing. I think she knew she wanted to leave, but she needed to be sure that she had the support system, that she had help. And they told her, I will help you. So I think that's all she really needed to feel comfortable enough to get her things and go. 4 days later, on January 12th, she left and never came back. I heard 2 different versions of this story. One version was that she pretended to go shopping and then never came back. Maybe she went out shopping, but I also found this. According to court documents, his passport bride confronted Heidnik about forcing her to watch him participate in joint sex with his spiritual wives. In a legal brief filed for her, she said that he told her that's the marriage custom in the United States, then beat her and made her stand in a corner for 14 hours. 3 months later, she hid her passport and dress in a trash bag, and under the pretense of taking out the trash, she escaped to a nearby shelter for abused wives. That seems more like the story than she was going shopping,
but the shopping story seems a bit more aligned with something Gary would say, because he talked about how he gave her a little bit of money to go shopping and he was nice and blah blah blah, and that the only thing he really did was he wasn't completely faithful to her, and that was the main issue. Betty didn't just leave Gary though, she also had him arrested and charged with assault, indecent assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. Unfortunately, these charges were later dismissed when Betty failed to appear at a preliminary hearing. Here's what Gary had to say about his relationship with Betty in his 6th letter to Dr. Jack Apsh. The allegations of spousal abuse are also fallacious. If you made the argument that I was not a very good husband, it would be a viable one. I am incapable of being uxorious. I don't even know what that means. All right, time to look up a word. Uxorious. I really hate Bing so much. Uxorious, having to show an excessive or submissive fondness for one's wife. Oh, what is the female version of uxorious? What? Okay. You learn something new every day. I was perhaps... Oh my god, these words, Gary, I can't. I was perhaps parsimonious. This letter is a lot. I was perhaps parsimonious, inattentive, and a philanderer, but I was not abusive. Betty made those claims in family court for the sole purpose of enhancing her claims for spousal support and vengeance for my philandering. Also, the rape charges were spurious. There had never been any rape or forced sex. When Betty had run away the first time in January '86, I contacted her relative in New York and instructed her that if Betty didn't return to me forthwith, I'd have her deported to the Philippines. Upon being informed of this threat, Betty concocted the phony rape charge and had me arrested. She succeeded in having me arrested by the police rather than simply swearing out a private warrant through the use of political connections. Mayor Good has a niece, and Betty occasionally cleaned her house up for gratis. Through his connection to James White, then to the police, the order came to arrest me for spousal rape. Gary and his crazy ideas. Later, after Betty and I reconciled, she dropped the charges against me without arbitring. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce some of these words. Without arbitring. To admit to their spuriousness would have been criminal and subjected her to deportation. To avoid that, I recommended she only drop charges. She also cleared me with the parole board, who were investigating me. While Betty and I lived together, our relationship was, to say the least, acrimonious. At one point, I actually fled and hid in the environs of Codiceville Veterans Hospital. I also took doses of Thorazine to weather her frequent tirades, but I have abused her. Oh, Gary, always playing the victim. Quite frankly, though, I was cheap. I only gave her a minuscule allowance of $5 a week, and in building her wardrobe, never bought anything elaborate. Most of her clothes came from Kmart, and there were even a few additions from thrift stores. She always had adequate food to eat and was gaining weight, although she had trouble adjusting to American food. My own personal car was, as you know, a '72 Dodge. I purchased her a '72 Plymouth that was in superior shape to my own Dodge and taught her to drive, although she never secured a license. After she returned in February, I raised her allowance to $20 a week and sought to be more generous, but never completely relented to my tight fiscal policy. $5 in 1986 has the purchasing power of what? $5 in 1986 is the equivalent today of $14.35. That was her weekly allowance, $14. That's crazy. So he upped it to $20, which today is the equivalent purchasing power of about $57.40. Okay. I did, however, on occasions of exuberance, give her $100 bills, though infrequently, and treated her to restaurants and movies. Our final falling out was when I refused to cohabitate with her ever in response to one of her never-ending tirades. She then became so incensed, she left the following morning after packing her car with all her property. So again, I reiterate, there was no spousal abuse on my part, although I was not a perfect husband either. So Betty leaves, and knowing Gary, I am much more inclined to believe her side of the story, but I wanted to also read his account just so that we could get his side of the whole story. But she leaves, and unbeknownst to Gary, Betty was actually pregnant, which in my opinion, if she was aware of it at the time, absolutely factored into getting the hell away from him, especially because of his baby factory obsessed fantasies. Who knows if he had talked about that with her or shared that with her or whatever, but he was increasingly obsessed with having a baby. He would find out about this later, but first he tried to kill himself. In February of 1986, he tried to do this by carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage, but his friends Tony Brown and Sandra Lindsay came to visit him at the house and apparently found him in the garage, like passed out. Gary actually wrote, he found me and I locked the door to the van. He told me he wasn't sure what to do, but after waiting 15 minutes or so, he called the rescue ambulance. He was proud of having saved me, but I berated him for doing it and made him promise not to interfere in the future. He promised he wouldn't. Poor Tony. Gary in his letter goes on to even tell Jack, because apparently he had tried to commit suicide so many different ways. He actually wrote his recommended ways of trying to take one's own life, which I'm obviously not gonna read here. But moving on, he was admitted to a hospital. Gary did a 6-month stay at the Codesville Hospital for this. So from March 1986 to August 1986. And this is pretty serious. This is what Gary writes. When I got admitted that time, they put me on a closed ward and kept me there for my whole admission, and the doctors wouldn't tell me why. Day after day, other patients kept getting transferred to the open wards, but not me. That never happened before in 20 years of hospitalizations, and I've always been wondering why. I suspected that Betty told the doctors something about physical abuse, so he would keep me on the closed ward and thus stop me from philandering. I've suspected that Betty told the doctors something about physical abuse, so he would keep me on the closed ward and thus stop me from philandering. I don't know why he puts philandering in quotes. But okay. Betty is, as you know, a very jealous woman and greatly resented me having affairs. I have to give Betty credit for that maneuver, though. By keeping me locked on the closed ward, it did stop me from messing around. She most certainly was in no physical danger from me, and I suspect the only mental abuse was her reaction to my philandering. This again really is insightful into Gary's mind, because it's like seemingly doesn't even seem to cross his mind that the doctors might have kept him on a closed ward during this time because he just tried to kill himself, and that he might be a danger to not only himself but possibly to others. But he always goes to conspiracy theories and always thinks that it's possible that, you know, this is all Betty's doing, and she talked to all my doctors, and she's the one that got me put on this ward. And I'm like, dude, you literally just tried to take your own life. But nope, it's all Betty's fault because she didn't want him having sex with other patients. I'm sure she didn't care. She was pregnant and wanted to get away from him. I'm sure she was like, I hope he stays there as long as possible. Who knows? Gary also at this point was still convinced, if not more convinced, that there was a conspiracy to take money away from his church. People were trying to gain access to his investment accounts and take his money. He was highly paranoid about that. As for telling the doctors on March 10th, 86, I don't recall telling him God gave me stock tips and that God told me to buy cars. I don't recall. I don't recall telling him God and Jesus talked to me and they call that my auditory hallucinations. I am aware they don't believe me when I tell them this, but I don't care. Personally, I don't understand why the Lord takes the time to talk to me since I most surely am not worthy. Oh my God, Gary. I read all this the first time, and then I read it again, recording this, and now I'm reading it again, recording this section the second time, and it's even crazier to me. He's nuts. he's nuts. In that same interview on March 10th, 1986, I think it's noteworthy that the doctor accused me of grandiosity when I told him of the church. There was a church. They don't always believe me when I'm telling the truth. Like I said, I was framed, and they did it to me to steal over $350,000. I don't think people were really trying to steal his money. If anything, they probably didn't believe him because he's so nuts. But even if they believed that he did come up with his own church, Gary does come across as being very grandiose, like a grandiose narcissist. And I think that's probably what the doctor meant. I don't think that it really had to do with accusing him of lying, but I don't know. I wasn't there, and I don't have the transcript of the interview he did with his doctor. In July of 1986, Gary's parole is up. So he no longer has to see a parole officer, but he also has another few weeks to a month at the Coatesville Hospital before he's released. So Gary is now released, and 1 month after his release, Betty Disto gave birth to their son. He was born September 15th, 1986, and she named him Jesse John Disto. Basically, he gets out of the Coatesville Hospital. A month later, his son is born, and this really, on top, Betty leaving him, their divorce, and her having a son, like, this really spurred on his fantasies and, like, baby obsession. He really could not take this. Gary goes into full I am God incarnate mode. He's had this fantasy of creating a birthing harem, and he is going to make it happen now. He had already been ordained by God to make a church. He'd already fathered children before, and now he was going to continue to spread the Heidnik name throughout the world. He was going to reach as far as he possibly could with this perceived power that he held. Gary's parole is up in July. Gary's released in August, and then in September, his son with Betty is born, and obviously he has no freaking custody. I don't even know at this point, I don't even think she told him about it yet. It's not until months later that she ends up contacting him for spousal support, or child support. In November of 1986 to March 1987, this is the crimes that Gary commits. These are the kidnappings, imprisonment, rape, and murders that occur that put Gary on death row, that give him capital punishment, that lead to his execution, and obviously the end of the lives of 2 women who he imprisoned. These are all of the major circumstances that led up into this point. So you can see why this chunk of the story was so important for me to re-record. Again, I don't know where the files went, but all of this led up to this happening. Gary actually later told his defense attorney, Chuck Peruto, that he, quote, wanted to have a perfect race of children from these women. So Gary's a racist. Whether the race is mixed or not, it doesn't matter. If you're looking to have the perfect race, then you're a frickin' racist. He's probably one of the strangest racists that I've ever heard of. The perfect race to Gary Heidnik is an ethnic mixed race where he is the paternal godfather-like figure. He's a white man with a racial fetishization for black women, and he has a biracial supremacy complex thing. God ordained. He's crazy. So Gary felt that kidnapping 6 black women and making them his sex slaves and keeping them in his basement to create a birthing harem would facilitate this. Anyway, that is the end of this section. Hi. From this point on, Gary Heidnik escalates. This is the turning point. His divorce with Betty, a couple months later, that is when he begins kidnapping women. These 6 women that would lead to him being on death row. And this is the end of part 1 of Death Row Last Meals, episode 4, Gary Michael Heidnik.
Keep an eye out for part 2. To help support me, subscribe to my platform, murderpm.com. That is Murder Pop magazine, where you can get behind-the-scenes access to hundreds of different articles, videos, and audio, with pictures and tons of different files for many, many different true crime stories. The link for that is in the description of this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Victoria Evans. Be safe out there.